understanding what dramatists were coming out through the classics and affecting the ideas of those in the Renaissance, because drama was a form which was really, truly dead. The idea of stage drama in the Dark Ages. We saw less advanced cultures, more primitive, could still form sculpts of their own epics. They could still take from people like Boethius a reading of the Consolation of Philosophy and sculpt their own moral framework from it. So with Alfred, it's even there throughout Romans the Rose, and was still there at the time of Chaucer. But none of them would have been able to think about drama. So Renaissance drama, what's its influences, and who are its influencers? Theatrical drama is distinct, very distinct from the fabliau. The fabliau is full of these tiny little adventures, these little quirks, oddities. Something small will happen and it'll be humorous. A drama, if we think about something like an Oedipus Rex of Sophocles, takes time to unfold, is slow and deliberative about its much wider process and arc as it goes through its acts. So even in terms of sculpture and framework, these are completely different modes of literature. So in the Middle Ages, we were stuffed with all these fabliaux, all these misadventures, short sequences of thrills interspersed with this lewd wordplay. It's targeted really more towards a man's lower sense of self. The Renaissance drama, looking back towards the Attic drama, Greek drama, or more interesting, Roman drama, sometimes, certainly in its tragedy, would look upwards and beyond. But it had to get there via first familiarizing yourself with drama as comedy, and we'll see who the influencers are there. Profound drama in particular owed its debt to 5 traits, which were in the playwrights, with the playwrights of ancient Greece and of ancient Rome. Number 1 is the conception of drama as a fine art. We talked about this with the fabliau. Many people who were making the fabliau did not really see what they were sculpting as a fine art. But when you're conducting a drama in the mold that has come from antiquity, there was that solemnity which came with the composition. That was key. Without looking to the Greeks and the Latinists as this almost this deified writer or dramatist, there wouldn't have been the earnestness or heart in the reemergence of drama in the Renaissance that was necessary. That's number 1. 2 is the realization of drama as a type of literature, full stop. Emerging from Dante and Chaucer, who, remember, around Dante couldn't even properly distinguish what is a comedy as opposed to a tragedy. Even in a poem, was his thing an epic? He called it a comedy. He was confused about that. He was like, oh no, I'm writing it in the Italian, therefore it's a comedy. So that's a confused understanding of what that even means. So, let alone the inculcation of drama. But in the Renaissance, we get things like Aristotle's Poetics translated, which is on the last one. That's going to get us much more in tune with the idea of drama as a type of tragedy. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, we see Polonius, who satirizes the players, who the 4 types of drama, 3 of which were classical, and mixed them accordingly. Right. So in Hamlet, he says, the best actors in the world, either for tragedy, comedy, pastoral comic, historical comic, tragical historical, tragical comical, historical pastoral, scene, indivisible, or poem unlimited. Seneca cannot be too heavy, nor Plautus too light. This is Polonius in Hamlet. He's making a play of it by that time. So where did we get to from between Dante and Shakespeare? We had this enormous understanding of drama as a form work, where by the time of Shakespeare's Hamlet, Polonius can satirize all of these mishmashes of different types of drama you can have, whereas Dante would never even understood the thing. So that's 2. It's just the idea of it as a source of literature, as a framework for literature. 3 is actually a bit more with the wider civilization. It's in the theatre building and principles of dramatic production. So it's actually more than just writing it. This is performing it, right? So we had a great beginning of building the theaters, which were going to be the housing places of the drama. Every great piece of drama needs its stage on which to perform. This was the movement away from the temporary scaffolding theatres of the Middle Ages and into a more permanent infrastructure. So to emulate the Greco-Roman sense of setting, which is, of course, if you think of any of the Greek tragedies, setting is key. And when they're building, they find other classical influences, such as Roman architect Vitruvius. His architectural forms come back into popularity, sort of re-emerge, you could use that language. And then by first realized in 1580, the first one really is the Olympic Theatre at Vicenza by classical architect Andrea Palladio. There's permanence, dignity, symmetry, long receding perspective. So this long perspective which can go back deep into the crowd rather than actually in London, don't think of the Globe, but think more of the Royal Opera House. The Royal Opera House is what's in the style of this new classical style. The Globe is kind of more has this mosh pits, it's more in the old style, even though it is not a temporary scaffold. Trait 4 is the structure of modern drama. And by what do I mean by the structure of modern drama? Classical elements contained in dramatic structure the following, right? Duration. Plays in the Middle Ages were short snippets, long divergent without resolution. So there were these two extremes. In drama, we get the perfect mode, 5 acts. The Japanese may have raised the tabloid to high art with the no dramas and serial dramas of kabuki, but the Middle Ages aren't there at all. The high art in the European sense and the Greco-Roman sense comes in the perfect medium, that Aristotelian mean between the massive expanding epic sort of dramas which would go on for days. They'd be re-erecting the scaffolds, continuing plot strands from weeks ago. There would be a hodgepodge, either that or there'd be tiny little snippets, little twinkles, nothing that could last, nothing of duration and sustenance. So that is a key bit of the structure, and we touched on how they did that. It was the division of these plays into acts, cohesive acts, more formalized in the Renaissance. Particularly popular is the 5-act structure. So when we think of a good Renaissance drama, it really has to have its 5 acts. Breakages in the play were more formalized, and more formalized than in ancient Greek theatre. And there's sometimes you see a chorus, it's never as stringently applied as it was in the Greek one. But for instance, the start of Henry V. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. Kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. They also were able, in terms of the 4th trait, that modern structure, complex characters, conflicts that are between people, the collisions of spiritual forces. It's not just sort of the mummer's farce, right? No, this is stemming from mounting suspense, because we've perfected the length of the play, and now the idea of suspense and character conflict, and then resolution or the lack of resolution, the resolution in a denouement, a sort of 5th act final collapse, that can now sculpt it. So once we have the stage, once we have the length, once we have the acts and proper breakages, character conflict just seeps in between the cracks of these structures and becomes far easier to write around. And then the 5th and final trait is simply that which we had in translation. Imitation, emulation. Translation, imitation, emulation were the 3 stages. We had translation, now it's sort of imitation, but also emulation. We're getting towards emulation. We're getting towards the idea of emulating the Greeks and the Romans. That sort of, if you think about making a budget or making something that's happening in the future, you set yourself this target, which is almost unachievable, and that will bring you up to higher standards than you've ever had or would have had otherwise. So we talked about the 5 traits, but what about in terms of characters? Who are the influencers from ancient Greece and Rome? 3 Athenian tragedians, Aeschylus 525 to 456 BC, 7 of whose plays remain. Sophocles 495 to 406 BC, 7 of whose plays remain. And Euripides 481 to around 406 BC, 19 of whose plays remain. So a lot more of Euripides remains than the other 2, but the 3 are sort of a cohesive group. Aeschylus being the one who came first, and then Sophocles and Euripides living afterwards. You can think of it kind of like Dante coming first, and then Boccaccio and Petrarch being of the same generation thereafter. So those are the Athenian tragedians. Athenian comedians, Aristophanes is the one to go to. 444 to 385 BC, 11 of whose plays remain. Roman comics, there's 2. Plautus, 254 to 184 BC. Again, think about those dates. That's quite early in the development of Rome. And that's where the comics come from. So Plautus is one of these, and the other one is Terence. Terence is 195 to 159 BC. 6 of Terence's plays remain, but we actually have 21 of Plautus's. So much more Plautus than Terence, but it's good to know them both on sort of a level playing field. And then the Roman tragedian of influence is actually Seneca. We've had him before in that Chaucer knew Seneca through mainly Boccaccio and Petrarch. We've seen him mentioned. Those are more his philosophical treatises, his epistles as well. This is Seneca's tragedy. It's a different aspect of Seneca. And of course, he comes later than the comedians or the comics of Rome. He is 4 to 64 AD, and his whole life is revolves around the Imperium of Nero. We mentioned before frameworks and the treaties that were important for them. Aristotle's Poetics and Horace's Art of Poetry, not to be forgotten either. Seneca found prominence specifically in Italy, and in England we see his character of the ambitious tyrant or the Roman general, himself modeled in Greece, modeled from Greece, but we see that idea of the ambitious tyrant coming forward in someone like Shakespeare's Richard III, or the Revengeful Ghost, working on the Aeschylean models, is found in the Oresteia, but that can be seen in Hamlet, for instance. So let's actually talk about some of the early Renaissance drama. They're not the best. We'll do a specific one on Shakespeare later, but we need to mention some of the forerunners, some of these guys who set the pace, mainly coming from Italy. And a lot of it started with translation, and started with translation of the brothers Menipmus of Plautus. Key translation being Niccolo de Correggio's 1486 one. This was again done in the Duke of Ferrara's court in Italy, and we know that is a key setting. If I mention Ferrara in the classical tradition, everyone should immediately be thinking of late 15th century drama, the beginning of Renaissance drama. It should be like almost a Pavlovian response. So the Senecan tragedies were being performed around 1509, translation of Sophocles' Antigone by Luigi Alemanni around 1533. So if you recall from our translation one, a lot of the key translations are in 1550, so these are the early translations that we're getting hung up on here. Then in steps Joachim de Bouillé and his defense of the ennoblement of the French language, in which he tries to say, listen, some of these plays coming from Italy or from the classics, they need to be done in French, or we need to be coming up with ideas that will make the French language as prominent as these other ones. Very important movement in 16th century France. Du Bellay being a member of the Pléiades, who by 1567 have co-members like Jean-Antoine de Bath, who he modernized Plautus's boastful soldier, the hero, for instance. So that's happening in France. Spain, there's Sophocles' Electra is getting translated. Plautus' Amphitryon, Portuguese, they're all starting to get in now. We're around 1530 to 1550. But in terms there of key Plautus texts, we mentioned Amphitryon, Brothers Menechmus, Boastful Soldier. These are kind of classics. Those are translations. Imitations, Echerinus of 1315 by Albertino Musato is a very early one. It's kind of a pace setter, but there are other early ones. You wouldn't have heard of them. They're still trying to sculpt out the perfect 5-act framework and all of the traits that we mentioned before, but I'll just rattle through a few of them. 1487, Cephalus by Nicola de Correggio, Casket Comedy by Ludovico Ariosto. Ariosto is going to be, you know him far more for Orlando Furiosa, for Renaissance epic, which we'll do next. But he also deviled in writing the Casket Comedy. We have into English George Gascoigne, 1566, as Supposes. So that's the beginning of the infiltration into England. You can see it's just a generation, a little bit 30 years before beginnings of Shakespeare. So George Gascoigne being critical there of those first seeds of infiltration. In France, it's a man by the name of Jodelle, who has a captive Cleopatra and Eugene in the 1550s are good ones. Seneca is a model for the captive Cleopatra. Eugene is octosyllabic meter. There's elements of Plautus and Terence in there for a comedy. So that's imitation. Emulation will have to wait. You know, Italian comedy went sour. I think even Machiavelli wrote much plays. It was not great. Aretino. If you read John Edwin Sands' book on the history of classical scholarship, he really does put an importance on the date 1527 for Italian Renaissance in literature, that being the sack of Rome by the troops of Charles V. Not an often mentioned paradigm shift sort of date, but for classical tradition and the Renaissance in Italy, it's a key date. After 1527, most of the key movements of the Renaissance is not going to be happening in Italy. It goes to France, it goes to the Low Countries, and eventually finds its way to England. Lope de Vega and Pedro Calderon are the two key writers in Spain around this time as well. You don't hear much from Spain, but those are two writers in the Renaissance who you should know. And there's a new art of making comedies by de Vega where he stresses moving away from Plautus, moving away from Terence's models. So that's an interesting development there. So we mentioned that the drama, the theatrical drama, was the perfect Aristotelian mean, but there were other forms of drama still occurring, of course. Renaissance drama had come in and found its influencers and its influences. The 5 traits we mentioned earlier, as well as all the dramatists we mentioned earlier from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But there'd still be flavors and an audience who wanted other types. So masks, most famously think of Milton's Comus. Pastoral dramas. The characters are sort of shepherds, modelled more off Theocritus and Virgil. Again, we'll talk about pastoral and romance. It's a different avenue of classical tradition. But for now, we're going to think about tragedians and comics from Rome and Greece. So we're not going to talk about pastoral and romance, but there was parts of it on the stage. Orpheus is always associated with the pastoral. Think also here Torquato Tasso, again more famous for his The Liberation of Jerusalem, which is a Renaissance epic, which we'll talk about next in Renaissance epics. So we'll talk about Ariosto's next, and Tasso, both more famous for being epic writers in the Renaissance, but they both dabbled in drama. Ariosto's translations we saw earlier, and when you're talking about pastorals, Tasso's Amintas, 1573, is a good go-to, just to have in your head of what we're talking about. Popular farce still was there. Think Punch and Judy, coming from Italian farce. And then final stages, we have the beginning of opera. The operatic tradition can be seen as something that European post-Renaissance civilization perfected to an art that nothing else has come close to. It was the perfect fusion of how it was creating classical music at the time, and we have nothing from the ancients with regards to that. Purely European art form, and then it sculpted it with the idea of Attic drama. So we have the beginnings of opera. It's gonna go from seeds, starting in sort of the Orpheus of Monteverdi, up to through to be the Don Giovanni of Mozart, and then reaching its pinnacle with Wagner and something in this Nibelung. So it's always nice to think of Renaissance drama, these humble beginnings, temporary scaffold, it's taken down, they look at Vitruvius, they erect pillars and stages of endurance, and then they also erect works of endurance on top of that. So next we're going to have Renaissance epic and a few more. But for now, I wouldn't get too bogged down in being very familiar with the works of imitation that we mentioned there. It's more for getting to know Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, Terence, Plautus, and Seneca. Those are the guys, those are the influencers coming from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, whose dramas we should be getting familiar with at this point. Okay, so next is Renaissance epic.